Here is a paradox that most people never notice. The most dangerous manipulators are rarely the best liars. In fact, many of them barely need to lie at all. We tend to imagine deception as something obvious: a forged story, a hidden scheme, a carefully constructed falsehood. But what if the real danger comes from something much simpler? What if the most powerful manipulator is the person who understands exactly what you already want to believe? And that brings us to George Wickham. Most readers remember Wickham for his charm, his confidence, his ability to make people feel comfortable around him. But focusing on his charm is like focusing on the key while ignoring the door it unlocks. Because charm alone explains very little. Every generation has charming people. Most of them never gain real influence. Most of them never reshape how entire communities think. Most of them never turn trust itself into a weapon. So the question is not why Wickham appears trustworthy. The real question is, why are people so ready to trust him in the first place? That question matters far more than it seems. Because Wickham represents something larger than a single character. He represents a pattern. A pattern that appears in friendships, workplaces, politics, social media, and almost every environment where human beings must decide who deserves their trust. And the uncomfortable truth is that people rarely judge others based on truth alone. They judge based on emotional fit, based on instinct, based on stories. Imagine a mirror that doesn't reflect reality. Imagine a mirror that reflects what you secretly hope is true. Most people would never notice the difference. They would simply admire the image looking back at them. That is the first memory fragment worth remembering, the distorted mirror. Wickham's influence begins there. Not with facts. Not with evidence. But with perception. And this is where the contradiction becomes fascinating. We often assume manipulation succeeds because people are unintelligent. Yet history repeatedly shows the opposite. Intelligent people are manipulated every day. Educated people. Experienced people. People who believe they are excellent judges of character. Why? Because manipulation rarely attacks logic first. It approaches through desire, through expectation, through the stories we have already started telling ourselves. The most effective manipulator does not force a new belief into your mind. He discovers an existing belief and quietly feeds it. That is why Wickham functions as more than a character inside a novel. He becomes a symbol of a deeper human vulnerability. The vulnerability of wanting reality to match our assumptions. And once that happens, something dangerous begins to unfold. Trust starts moving away from character and toward appearance. Reputation starts outweighing truth. The person who tells the most satisfying story gains power over the person who tells the most accurate one. Think about that for a moment. What happens to a community when storytelling becomes more persuasive than reality? What happens when a smile becomes stronger than evidence? What happens when the person standing on the stage is believed, not because he is right, but because he understands exactly what the audience wants to hear? That question sits at the center of Wickham's legacy. Because the deeper mystery was never how he convinced people. The deeper mystery is why people were already prepared to convince themselves. If people are already prepared to convince themselves, then a deeper question emerges. How do they become prepared in the first place? Because trust does not appear out of nowhere. It is built on invisible assumptions. Assumptions about what honesty looks like. What integrity sounds like. What a good person is supposed to feel like when they enter a room. And this is where the conflict at the heart of Wickham's influence becomes much more unsettling. Most people believe they judge character directly. In reality, they often judge signals. Confidence becomes evidence. Charm becomes credibility. Vulnerability becomes authenticity. And familiarity becomes truth. But those things are not the same. A person can possess every signal of trustworthiness while lacking the substance beneath it. That distinction sounds obvious when stated aloud. Yet communities fail this test over and over again. Why? Because human beings are not merely truth-seeking creatures. We are pattern-seeking creatures. We are constantly searching for narratives that make the world feel understandable. And once we find one, we become surprisingly protective of it. This is where another memory fragment emerges. Picture a crowded theater. The audience sits in darkness while a spotlight illuminates the stage. Everyone watches the same performance. Everyone believes they are seeing reality. But the spotlight is not reality. It is only a selected piece of reality. What remains hidden in the shadows often matters far more. Wickham's true influence operates inside that spotlight. Not by creating every perception, but by directing attention. Because controlling attention is often more powerful than controlling facts. That idea becomes even more disturbing when we examine the role of Darcy. At first glance, Darcy and Wickham appear to represent opposite personalities. But psychologically, they represent something much larger. One represents what people readily accept. The other represents what people resist. Not because one is easier to understand, but because one fits existing assumptions better. This creates a contradiction that echoes far beyond the novel. The truth does not automatically win. In fact, truth often begins at a disadvantage. Truth is frequently incomplete, awkward, uncomfortable. It asks people to revise their beliefs. Stories that flatter existing assumptions demand much less effort. And the human mind loves efficiency. That is the revelation slowly taking shape beneath the surface. The battlefield was never between honesty and dishonesty alone. The battlefield was between comfort and correction. Between emotional certainty and intellectual humility. Between the story people preferred and the reality they had not yet examined. Once that distinction becomes visible, Wickham transforms from a character into a warning. A warning about something every community eventually faces. The moment when popularity begins replacing judgment. The moment when appearances begin replacing investigation. The moment when a reputation becomes so persuasive that nobody asks whether it was earned. And this is where the consequences start expanding beyond individuals. Because when communities repeatedly reward perception over reality, they create incentives. Incentives for performance. Incentives for image management. Incentives for becoming believable rather than becoming truthful. The result is not merely one mistaken judgment. The result is an environment where the wrong traits rise to the top. And once that environment exists, people begin adapting to it. The honest become quieter. The skeptical become isolated. The performers become influential. The spotlight grows brighter. The shadows grow deeper. And perhaps that is the most dangerous stage of all. Not when deception succeeds, but when entire groups begin participating in it without realizing they are doing so. Which leads to an even larger mystery. If Wickham's greatest strength was not his ability to tell a convincing story, but his ability to recognize hidden desires inside other people, then what exactly were those desires? What was he seeing inside them that they could not yet see inside themselves? What was he seeing inside them that they could not yet see inside themselves? The answer begins with a contradiction that most people find difficult to accept. We like to believe that manipulation starts with the manipulator. But often, it starts with the audience. Not because people are foolish. Not because they are weak. But because every human being carries invisible psychological investments. Investments in identity. Investments in status. Investments in the stories that help them make sense of the world. And once those investments exist, protecting them can become more important than questioning them. This is where the crisis hidden beneath Wickham's influence starts to emerge. His role is not merely to persuade. His role is to provide emotional confirmation. That distinction changes everything. A person who persuades must overcome resistance. A person who confirms existing beliefs encounters very little resistance at all. Think about how powerful that is. If someone tells you something completely unfamiliar, you become cautious. But if someone tells you what you already suspect, what you already fear, or what you secretly hope is true, your defenses often begin to lower before you realize it. The gate opens from the inside. And that creates another memory fragment. Imagine a fortress with towering walls. Most people assume danger comes from an enemy breaking through the gates. But the greatest danger comes when the gatekeeper opens them voluntarily. The fortress is not conquered. It cooperates. That is the deeper psychological architecture beneath trust manipulation. The contradiction becomes even more unsettling when we examine what communities reward. Communities often claim to value truth. Yet many communities unconsciously reward confidence, certainty, and emotional clarity far more consistently. Why? Because truth is frequently complicated. Truth contains ambiguity. Truth forces patience. But certainty feels immediate. Certainty feels safe. Certainty feels satisfying. And the human mind is constantly searching for relief from uncertainty. That search creates a vulnerability larger than any individual character. Now the scale begins to shift. What appears at first to be a social dynamic between a few individuals starts revealing itself as a recurring pattern in human civilization. Throughout history, influential figures have rarely succeeded because they possessed perfect information. Many succeeded because they understood emotional demand. They recognized what people wanted to hear before people recognized it themselves. The spotlight follows them. The crowd gathers around them. The story becomes stronger than the scrutiny. And this leads us to a revelation hidden beneath the surface of the entire conflict. Perhaps the true opposite of manipulation is not intelligence. Perhaps it is discomfort. The willingness to sit with uncertainty. The willingness to question a satisfying narrative. The willingness to examine whether a belief feels true because it is true, or because it is emotionally rewarding. That is a much harder task. And it explains why the conflict represented by Wickham never truly disappears. Every generation believes it has become more sophisticated. Every generation believes it has learned from the mistakes of the previous one. Yet the same pattern continues. Different faces. Different institutions. Different technologies. The same psychological mechanism. The distorted mirror remains. The spotlight remains. The open gate remains. And the consequences extend far beyond mistaken judgments about individuals. When emotional confirmation becomes the primary currency of trust, entire systems begin to change. Leaders learn what audiences want. Media learns what audiences want. Influencers learn what audiences want. Algorithms learn what audiences want. Gradually, an invisible marketplace emerges. Not a marketplace of truth. A marketplace of emotional validation. And here the mystery becomes larger than Wickham himself. Because if people are not primarily searching for truth, but for confirmation, and if the most influential figures are often the ones who supply that confirmation, then perhaps the central question is no longer about deception. Perhaps the real question is why human beings become so attached to certain stories in the first place. What hidden need makes a comforting illusion feel more valuable than an uncomfortable reality? That is the question standing in the shadows, waiting to be explored. What hidden need makes a comforting illusion feel more valuable than an uncomfortable reality? The answer begins with a revelation that changes the entire shape of the problem. Human beings do not merely seek information. They seek psychological stability. We often assume that beliefs exist to help us understand the world. But many beliefs serve another function entirely. They help us preserve a sense of identity. They help us maintain a coherent story about who we are, who deserves our trust, and how the world ought to work. Once a belief becomes attached to identity, challenging that belief no longer feels like a correction. It feels like a threat. This is where the deeper significance of Wickham emerges. His influence does not come from superior intelligence or extraordinary deception. His influence comes from occupying a very specific role inside the psychological ecosystem of a community. He becomes a guardian of comforting assumptions. He protects narratives people already wish to preserve. And that creates a remarkable paradox. The more a story reinforces identity, the less evidence it often requires to survive. Consider another memory fragment. Imagine an old house built on a cracked foundation. The cracks are hidden beneath expensive furniture, fresh paint, and beautiful decoration. Everyone admires the house. No one wants to discuss the foundation. Not because the cracks are invisible, but because acknowledging them would force costly change. The house remains standing. The illusion remains intact. Yet the weakness continues to grow underneath. This is what happens when communities become emotionally invested in their own interpretations. The danger no longer comes from false information alone. The danger comes from the collective desire to avoid uncomfortable revision. Suddenly, the conflict expands beyond trust. It becomes a conflict between psychological comfort and intellectual responsibility, between preserving a preferred worldview and confronting a more complicated reality. And this leads to a deeper insight about why certain figures gain influence across different eras. They act as emotional architects. They do not simply communicate ideas. They construct environments where people feel understood, validated, and protected from uncertainty. That feeling is powerful. Sometimes more powerful than truth itself. The consequence reaches far beyond individual relationships. Entire institutions can become vulnerable to the same dynamic. Entire cultures can become attached to stories that reward certainty over reflection. Over time, the habit becomes self-reinforcing. People trust what feels familiar. Familiarity creates acceptance. Acceptance creates legitimacy. Legitimacy creates influence. Influence attracts more trust. The cycle continues. And eventually, very few people remember where the cycle began. This is why the distorted mirror remains such an important symbol. The mirror does not invent a new face. It simply reshapes the one already standing in front of it. In the same way, the most influential manipulators rarely create desires from nothing. They amplify desires that already exist. They magnify blind spots that communities have chosen not to examine. And here the revelation becomes even more unsettling. Perhaps the central issue was never whether people could recognize deception. Perhaps the deeper issue is whether people are willing to recognize themselves, their ambitions, their resentments, their need for validation, their attachment to certain narratives. Because if those forces remain hidden, they become predictable. And whatever becomes predictable can be influenced. Which leads to a final revelation that is not yet complete. What if the most dangerous thing in this entire dynamic is neither the manipulator nor the audience? What if both are symptoms of something larger, a hidden mechanism inside human nature itself that quietly determines which stories survive, which truths are ignored, and which voices ultimately gain power? What if the hidden mechanism is not deception at all? What if deception is only the visible symptom of something far more fundamental? This is the point where the entire pattern comes into focus. The deepest revelation is that the central conflict was never between a manipulator and his targets. It was between two competing forces inside every human mind. The first force seeks truth, even when truth is uncomfortable. The second seeks coherence, even when coherence requires distortion. Most people assume these two forces are allies. They are not. Very often they are rivals. And when they collide, coherence usually wins first. This is the insight hidden beneath the role that Wickham plays. He is not merely a person. He is a function. He represents the force that rewards psychological coherence over objective reality. His influence emerges whenever a narrative feels more emotionally satisfying than the uncertainty that truth demands. That is why focusing on whether someone is honest or dishonest misses the deeper lesson. The real question is which force inside the audience is being activated. The desire to discover reality, or the desire to preserve a stable self-image. Consider another memory fragment. Imagine a map and a landscape. The map helps people navigate. Over time, generations become attached to the map. They trust it. They defend it. They teach it to others. But eventually the landscape changes. Rivers move. Roads disappear. New terrain emerges. At that moment, a choice appears. Update the map, or continue trusting a familiar picture of a world that no longer exists. The strange thing is that many people will defend the map long after it stops describing reality. Not because they are irrational, but because the map has become part of their identity. This is the deepest layer of the conflict. Human beings do not merely inhabit stories. Stories inhabit human beings. They shape perception. They organize attention. They determine what feels believable before evidence is even examined. Suddenly, the distorted mirror, the spotlight, the fortress gate, and the cracked foundation all connect into a single structure. They are different expressions of the same phenomenon. Reality competes with narrative. And narrative often receives a head start. The consequence is profound. Once a community becomes organized around emotionally satisfying narratives, trust begins to flow toward those who reinforce the narrative rather than those who challenge it. The incentives change. Social approval changes. Influence changes. Entire systems of reputation begin rewarding confirmation over correction. This is why the lesson extends far beyond literature. It appears in institutions, in cultural movements, in markets, in politics, in media ecosystems, in personal relationships. Wherever human beings gather, the same tension emerges. The desire to know what is true collides with the desire to protect what feels meaningful. And here is the revelation that many readers overlook. The most dangerous power is not the ability to manufacture belief. That power is limited. The more dangerous power is the ability to identify beliefs that already exist and quietly position yourself as their guardian. That is what gives certain individuals extraordinary influence. They appear to lead. In reality, they are often following desires that were already present beneath the surface. Which leads to a consequence large enough to reshape how we understand the entire story. If the greatest vulnerability is not ignorance but attachment, then every society carries within itself the conditions necessary for its own blind spots. Every generation. Every ideology. Every community. The question is not whether those blind spots exist. The question is whether people can recognize them before they become foundations for collective judgment. And if entire systems of trust can be built upon assumptions that nobody thinks to question, what kind of legacy do those assumptions leave behind once they become embedded in a culture, a community, or even a civilization? If entire systems of trust can be built upon assumptions that nobody thinks to question, then the most important question is no longer how influence is gained. The most important question is what remains after that influence has done its work. Because every belief leaves a footprint. Every assumption shapes behavior. Every narrative creates consequences that extend far beyond the moment it first appeared. This is where legacy begins. Not as a monument. Not as a reputation. But as a pattern that continues reproducing itself long after the original actors have disappeared. The consequence hidden beneath this conflict is not merely that some people make poor judgments. The deeper consequence is that entire communities can inherit habits of perception. They learn what kinds of people deserve trust. They learn which voices feel credible. They learn which stories are rewarded and which are ignored. Over time, these habits become invisible. They no longer feel like choices. They feel like reality itself. This is why the legacy of a figure like Wickham is ultimately psychological rather than personal. His significance survives because the pattern survives. The distorted mirror survives. The spotlight survives. The open gate survives. The cracked foundation survives. These are not simply symbols inside a novel. They are recurring features of human behavior. Every generation rebuilds them in different forms. Consider another memory fragment. Imagine footprints in fresh snow. One person walks across an empty field. A second person follows the same path. Then a third. Then hundreds more. Eventually a trail appears. Future travelers assume the trail exists because it is the correct route. Few stop to ask who created it. Fewer still ask whether it leads where they actually want to go. This is how inherited assumptions operate. They become social pathways. They become mental shortcuts. They become collective instincts. And once those instincts become established, people begin making decisions inside structures they never consciously chose. The scale now expands beyond communities and into culture itself. Cultural narratives determine what societies admire. They determine which traits become aspirational. They determine which forms of influence gain legitimacy. The consequences can persist for decades, sometimes centuries. Not because anyone planned them, but because repeated assumptions slowly become embedded in institutions, traditions, and expectations. This creates a profound philosophical tension. Human beings need shared stories. Without them, social cooperation becomes difficult. Yet the same stories that create cohesion can also create blindness. The same narratives that unite people can prevent them from questioning themselves. The same trust that makes communities possible can make communities vulnerable. That is the paradox at the heart of the entire discussion. The qualities that allow societies to function are often the same qualities that can be exploited. Trust creates connection. Trust also creates exposure. Belonging creates meaning. Belonging can also create conformity. Certainty creates confidence. Certainty can also create blind spots. And perhaps this is why the legacy of the conflict feels so enduring. It is not warning us about a particular type of person. It is warning us about a permanent feature of human nature. The tendency to confuse familiarity with truth. The tendency to inherit perceptions rather than examine them. The tendency to protect narratives long after they stop serving reality. Which brings us to the mystery that still remains unresolved. If every generation carries these vulnerabilities, and if every community inevitably develops its own distorted mirrors, then is the goal to eliminate them entirely? Or is the deeper challenge learning how to recognize them before they quietly become the foundation beneath everything we believe? At the end of the story, what remains is not a lesson about a particular individual. What remains is a question about ourselves. That is why this pattern continues to feel relevant long after the details of any single era have faded. The deeper significance was never contained within one personality, one community, or one moment of misunderstanding. It lives in a permanent tension within human nature. The tension between seeing the world as it is and seeing the world as we need it to be. Throughout this journey, certain images have followed us. The distorted mirror. The spotlight. The open gate. The cracked foundation. The footprints in the snow. None of them are merely symbols of deception. They are symbols of perception. They remind us that reality is rarely encountered directly. It is filtered through assumptions, emotions, identities, and stories that quietly shape what we notice and what we ignore. Perhaps that is why works like this endure. Not because they provide answers, but because they expose mechanisms that remain active beneath modern life. Technology changes. Institutions change. Cultures change. Yet the architecture of human judgment remains remarkably familiar. We still search for belonging. We still seek certainty. We still gravitate toward narratives that help us feel oriented in a complicated world. And there is nothing inherently wrong with that. Human beings need meaning. We need stories. We need shared frameworks that allow us to cooperate and build communities. The challenge begins when those frameworks become invisible to us. When the map becomes more important than the landscape. When the spotlight becomes more important than what remains outside its beam. When the trail in the snow becomes accepted simply because others walked it first. The final insight may be simpler than it first appears. Wisdom is not the absence of influence. No one exists outside influence. Wisdom may be the ability to notice when a belief feels emotionally satisfying and to pause before treating that feeling as proof. It may be the willingness to examine the foundation beneath the house rather than admiring the decoration above it. It may be the courage to stand in uncertainty a little longer before accepting the comfort of a conclusion. That is a difficult task. It has always been difficult. And perhaps that is why the pattern never fully disappears. Every generation inherits new stories, new assumptions, and new mirrors. Every generation believes it sees clearly. Every generation discovers blind spots it did not know it had. In that sense, the most enduring legacy is not a warning about manipulation. It is a reminder of humility. A reminder that our greatest vulnerabilities are often connected to our deepest needs. The need to belong. The need to understand. The need to feel certain that we are seeing the world correctly. And perhaps the most important question is not whether we can identify the distortions around us. Perhaps the more difficult question is whether we can recognize the distortions we have grown comfortable living with. Because the stories that shape our lives are rarely the ones we consciously choose. They are often the ones we stop questioning. And if that is true, then maybe the most consequential question any person can ask is this: when you look into the mirror of your own assumptions, are you seeing reality as it is? Or are you seeing a reflection that has been quietly waiting for you to believe it all along?